Across the Andromeda spiral, where civilizations rise and fall with the predictable monotony of binary star systems, the Zephyrian Empire had established itself as the undisputed master of recreational violence. Their arena complex on Kepler 442b stretched across 17 square kilometers of polished obsidian and crystalline viewing platforms, a monument to the galactic truth that bigger always meant better, and louder always meant more entertaining. The Zephyrians themselves stood as living proof of this philosophy. 10 feet of scaled muscle and evolutionary arrogance, they had conquered 47 star systems through the simple expedient of being excellent at hitting things very hard. Their gladiator culture had evolved from this fundamental strength, transforming what was once crude battlefield prowess into an art form that drew spectators from across 3 galactic arms. The arena's champion gladiators were legends in their own considerable lifetimes. Each stood 12 to 14 feet tall, their exoskeletons decorated with ceremonial scars and victory tattoos that told stories of conquered enemies and shattered bones. They fought with weapons that could cleave through starship hulls, their roars echoing across stadium tiers filled with cheering aliens who bet fortunes on which appendage would be severed first. At the apex of this pyramid of violence sat the Zephyrian nobles, whose idea of sophisticated entertainment involved watching their pet killers tear each other apart in increasingly creative ways. They lounged in climate-controlled observation pods, sipping fermented neural fluids while placing wagers on gladiator mortality rates with the casual indifference of beings who had never faced genuine physical threat. The galactic hierarchy was beautifully simple, really. Zephyrians occupied the penthouse suite of civilization, followed by their various client species who had proven useful enough to avoid complete annihilation. The Krathori provided engineering services, the Velux handled administrative duties, and the Morganti managed the more delicate aspects of interstellar finance. Each species had found their niche in the grand design, contributing their particular talents to the smooth operation of empire. And then, at the very bottom of this carefully constructed social pyramid, wedged somewhere between livestock and decorative fungi, were the humans. Humans had achieved the remarkable distinction of being simultaneously the most numerous and least respected species in known space. They bred like bacteria, died like mayflies, and possessed the unfortunate combination of curiosity and insufficient firepower to make that curiosity particularly dangerous. When the Zephyrian expansion fleets had reached the Sol system, they had found a species that built their weapons out of metal alloys and still used chemical propulsion for interplanetary travel. The conquest had taken approximately 4 hours. What followed was 3 decades of humans being scattered across Zephyrian space as indentured servants, manual laborers, and various forms of living decoration. They were small enough to fit into maintenance spaces, clever enough to follow complex instructions, and replaceable enough that nobody worried too much about occupational safety standards. The perfect workforce for an empire that valued efficiency over empathy. The arena gladiators, however, had always been denied access to human servants. The reasoning was sound enough. Beings whose entire existence revolved around ritual combat needed to maintain their edge, their hunger for violence. Giving them servants might make them soft, complacent. The arena masters wanted their champions lean, mean, and perpetually irritated. This policy worked beautifully until High Arbiter Vex Calamar decided that his gladiators had earned a reward for their recent performance in the Centennial Blood Games. 17 consecutive victories, 12 species represented, and enough dismemberment to keep the cleanup crews busy for months. Such dedication deserved recognition. The Arbiter's solution demonstrated the kind of creative thinking that had made the Zephyrian Empire the dominant force in local galactic politics. Rather than give his gladiators the traditional rewards of better weapons or enhanced rations, he would provide them with something far more entertaining. Pets. Not just any pets, of course. The arena champions were warriors of distinction, beings whose very presence commanded respect across known space. They deserved companions worthy of their status. After careful consideration, the Arbiter selected the most appropriate creatures for such distinguished beings. Human children. The logic was unassailable. Children were small enough to be easily managed, young enough to be properly trained, and human enough to provide endless amusement without posing any conceivable threat. They could serve as stress relief after difficult battles, entertainment during the long periods between arena events, and perhaps even develop into useful servants as they matured. The fact that they were sentient merely added to their value as companions. 27 Gladiator champions would each receive their own human child, selected from the most recent batch of acquisitions from the Outer Rim territories. The children ranged in age from 8 to 14 standard years, having been chosen specifically for their apparent health and manageable size. They had been cleaned, fed, and provided with basic medical care to ensure they would provide maximum entertainment value. The presentation ceremony was scheduled for the following day, timed to coincide with the arena's rest period between major tournaments. The gladiators would receive their gifts in the traditional manner, with appropriate ceremony and the expectation that they would demonstrate proper appreciation for the Arbiter's generosity. What none of the Zephyrians bothered to consider was the rather significant difference between giving a warrior a pet and giving a predator prey that happened to be inconveniently intelligent. The distinction would prove important in ways that the Empire's finest military minds had somehow failed to anticipate. The arena complex hummed with preparation as servants arranged viewing platforms and ceremonial weapons for the presentation. In the gladiator quarters, champions polished their victory scars and discussed what they might name their new acquisitions. Some planned elaborate training regimens, others contemplated creative uses for small, nimble servants. In the holding cells beneath the arena floor, 27 human children sat quietly and listened to everything their captors said. They had been listening very carefully for quite some time now, learning about their new environment with the focused attention that their species applied to survival situations. They understood exactly what they were intended to become. They had other plans entirely. The presentation ceremony unfolded with all the pomp and circumstance that Zephyrian culture could muster, which was considerable given their natural flair for dramatic excess. High Arbiter Vex Calamar presided from his ceremonial platform, flanked by arena officials whose job was primarily to look impressive and occasionally nod at appropriate moments. The gladiator champions assembled in the arena's central ring, their massive forms casting shadows across the polished stone floor. Each warrior represented the pinnacle of their respective combat disciplines. Some specialized in blade work that could carve through reinforced titanium, others had mastered the art of crushing opponents with their bare claws, and a few had achieved a legendary status through their creative use of arena hazards to eliminate enemies. The human children were brought forth in individual containment modules, transparent cylinders that allowed for easy viewing while preventing any inconvenient escape attempts. Each cylinder bore a numerical designation and basic biological data: age, approximate mass, notable physical characteristics. The presentation had all the warmth and personal touch of a livestock auction, which was precisely the effect the organizers had intended. Champion Grix Thalor, winner of 43 consecutive death matches, examined his assigned child with the critical eye of a being accustomed to evaluating potential training partners. The small human inside the cylinder appeared to be approximately 10 standard years old, possessed of the pale coloration typical of its species, and demonstrated the expected behavioral patterns of standing very still while trying not to make direct eye contact with large predators. Adequate bone structure, Grix Thalor rumbled, his voice carrying the kind of bass resonance that could rattle starship hulls. Should provide reasonable entertainment value once properly conditioned. The other champions conducted similar evaluations, discussing the finer points of human physiology with the detached professionalism of beings who had spent their careers studying the most efficient methods of causing bodily harm. They noted the creature's apparent fragility, their lack of natural weapons, and their tendency to exhibit what appeared to be fair responses when confronted with superior predators. All very encouraging signs for successful domestication. The handover process proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Each gladiator received custody documents, basic care instructions, and a small kit of training implements designed for use with particularly recalcitrant pets. The children were transferred from their transport cylinders to individual restraint harnesses that would prevent them from wandering off while allowing sufficient freedom of movement for basic exercise and entertainment purposes. Champion Vorth Canex accepted his assigned human with the satisfaction of a being who had earned a particularly valuable prize. The child was slightly larger than average for its species, displaying what the intake documentation described as above-average alertness levels and notable observational behaviors. Such traits suggested intelligence, which would make the training process more engaging and the eventual results more satisfying. "Come along then, little creature," Vorth Canex instructed, leading his new acquisition toward the gladiator quarters. "Time to learn your place in the natural order." The child followed without resistance, which the champion interpreted as encouraging evidence of proper submissive instincts. What he failed to notice was the way those supposedly fearful eyes tracked every detail of their route, the locations of security sensors, the timing of guard patrols, the mechanical vulnerabilities of door-locking mechanisms, and the acoustic properties of corridor intersections that would either amplify or muffle sound transmission. The gladiator quarters had been designed with the assumption that their occupants were large, straightforward beings whose needs centered around rest, nutrition, and the maintenance of combat equipment. Each champion maintained a private suite consisting of sleeping areas, training spaces, and weapon storage, all built to accommodate creatures of considerable size and strength. The quarters had not been designed with the assumption that they might house small, intelligent creatures capable of fitting through ventilation systems, manipulating electronic interfaces, or spending hours memorizing the behavioral patterns of beings who considered them too insignificant to monitor carefully. Champion Drac Morlith discovered this oversight approximately 6 hours after taking custody of his assigned human. He had secured the child in what he assumed was an adequately contained area of his quarters, provided basic sustenance, and settled down for his customary post-ceremony rest period. The containment area featured reinforced barriers, designed to hold creatures many times stronger than a human child, surveillance equipment calibrated for beings of gladiator proportions, and security systems that would trigger alarms if anything larger than a maintenance drone attempted unauthorized movement. When Drac Morlith awoke, his weapons had been rearranged. Not stolen, not damaged, not even moved very far. Simply rearranged in ways that demonstrated someone had examined each piece of equipment with considerable care and attention to mechanical detail. His ceremonial blade had been disassembled and reassembled with microscopic precision. His impact gauntlets had been adjusted to different weight distributions. His arena armor bore tiny scratches in patterns that suggested systematic testing of material composition and structural weak points. The child sat exactly where it had been left, displaying the same apparent docility it had shown throughout the custody transfer. When questioned, it produced sounds that the translator systems interpreted as confusion and denial. Its body language suggested the kind of innocent bewilderment that Drac Morlith associated with creatures too simple to engage in deliberate deception, except for the eyes. Those remained alert, calculating, and far too intelligent for his comfort. Champion Zek Haroth experienced similar mysteries. His assigned human appeared to sleep for appropriate periods, consume provided nutrition, and respond to basic commands with acceptable compliance. Yet somehow, items throughout his quarters had acquired slight modifications. electronic systems displayed minor configuration changes that improved their efficiency. Structural elements showed microscopic signs of stress testing. Air circulation patterns had been optimized in ways that suggested someone had mapped atmospheric flow dynamics with considerable precision. When he attempted to track these modifications to their source, Zekharoth discovered that his quarter's surveillance systems had developed an unfortunate tendency to experience brief operational gaps at precisely the moments when such activities might have been recorded. The pattern repeated across the Gladiator quarters. Champions who had expected to spend their time training compliant pets instead found themselves puzzling over evidence of unauthorized technical modifications, impossible movement patterns, and the growing suspicion that their small charges possessed capabilities that differed significantly from official assessments. Champion Rix Valdor, whose combat specialty involved the systematic dismantling of opponents through precision joint manipulation, prided himself on his observational skills. He had noticed that his human seemed to spend considerable time studying the mechanical operation of his training equipment, the structural engineering of his quarters, and the behavioral patterns of gladiators throughout the complex. "Curious little thing," he had remarked to Champion Grix Thalor during their regular equipment maintenance period. "Almost seems to be conducting some kind of analysis." "Impossible," Grix Thalor had replied with the confidence of a being whose worldview depended on clear hierarchical distinctions. "Humans lack the cognitive capacity for strategic thinking." Arena Intelligence confirmed this during the initial species evaluation. Arena Intelligence had indeed confirmed this, based on their comprehensive study of human military records, which had concluded that any species still using kinetic projectile weapons and chemical explosives clearly lacked the intellectual sophistication necessary for complex tactical planning. Arena Intelligence had not considered the possibility that a species might use simple tools because they were effective, not because they were all they could understand. They had not contemplated the idea that humans might prefer chemical explosives because they were reliable and versatile, not because they couldn't grasp more advanced technologies. Most importantly, they had never examined what happened when humans were given access to advanced alien technology and sufficient time to study its operation. This oversight was beginning to produce results that would have alarmed Arena Intelligence considerably, had they been paying attention to the right indicators. The Gladiator champions continued their daily routines, training for upcoming tournaments while attempting to establish proper dominance relationships with their new acquisitions. They approached this task with the methodical professionalism of beings who had extensive experience in breaking the spirits of potential threats. They failed to recognize that some spirits don't break under pressure. Some spirits adapt, learn, and begin planning what comes next. In the depths of the arena complex, 27 human children continued their careful observation of Zephyrian technology, gladiator behavioral patterns, and facility security protocols. They had been given access to the most advanced military installation in the local galactic region, unlimited time to study its operation, and the invaluable advantage of being considered too insignificant to pose any conceivable threat. The Zephyrians had made their position abundantly clear. Humans were prey animals, suitable for entertainment and manual labor, incapable of representing any meaningful challenge to superior beings. The children had listened very carefully to this assessment. They understood their designated role in the Zephyrian worldview. They had decided to audition for a different part entirely. Champion Krell Vorthak was discovered on the morning of the 13th day, sprawled across his training chamber in what the arena's medical examiners diplomatically termed an unusual configuration of bodily components. The preliminary investigation revealed several puzzling details. Krell Vorthak had apparently died from catastrophic structural failure of his primary respiratory system, caused by the precise application of pressure to a combination of nerve clusters that most species didn't even know existed. His combat-grade exoskeleton bore microscopic stress fractures that suggested someone had spent considerable time mapping its molecular composition before identifying the exact points where targeted force would produce maximum systemic damage. Most perplexing of all, his assigned human child was found sleeping peacefully in its designated containment area, displaying no signs of distress or unusual activity. The surveillance system showed no evidence of unauthorized movement, no indication of struggle, and no explanation for how a creature weighing 37 kilograms could generate sufficient force to neutralize a gladiator whose combat record included victories over opponents twice his size. Arena security conducted their investigation with the thoroughness of beings who understood that unexplained deaths in a facility full of professional killers required careful attention to detail. They interviewed witnesses, analyzed forensic evidence, and reviewed months of surveillance data with the methodical precision that had made Zephyrian law enforcement the envy of 3 galactic sectors. They concluded that Vortic had suffered an extremely rare physiological failure, possibly related to accumulated stress damage from decades of arena combat. The timing was unfortunate, but medical anomalies occurred even among the most physically robust specimens. The investigation was classified as a natural death pending further analysis. Champion Thex Gorlane was found 5 days later, having apparently expired from what appeared to be catastrophic neural system overload. The circumstances were remarkably similar to Vorthak's demise. Precise targeting of critical biological systems, no signs of struggle, and no explanation for how such injuries could have been inflicted without specialized knowledge of Zephyrian physiology. His assigned human child was discovered in the same condition as the previous case, sleeping peacefully, showing no distress, apparently having been secured in its containment area throughout the relevant time period. The surveillance systems had again recorded nothing unusual, though subsequent analysis revealed brief periods of optical distortion that might have indicated equipment malfunction. By the time Champion Drax Mollith joined his colleagues in whatever passed for a Zephyrian afterlife, Arena security had begun to suspect that their investigation protocols might require adjustment. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 champion gladiators had died from precisely targeted injuries that required intimate knowledge of their species' biological vulnerabilities. In each case, the only potential witnesses were human children who appeared to lack both the physical capability and technical knowledge necessary to inflict such damage. The surveillance systems consistently failed to record any evidence of unauthorized activity during the relevant time periods. More disturbing still, the remaining gladiator champions had begun exhibiting signs of what could only be described as paranoia. Beings who had spent their careers dominating opponents through raw physical superiority were now checking their quarters multiple times per day, installing additional security measures, and developing an unfortunate tendency to avoid spending extended periods alone with their assigned humans. Champion Vorth Canex had begun sleeping with one eye open, metaphorically speaking, since Zephyrian anatomy didn't actually permit that particular arrangement. He had noticed that his assigned child seemed to possess an uncanny ability to appear in locations where it shouldn't have been able to go, demonstrate knowledge it shouldn't have been able to acquire, and maintain an expression of innocent confusion whenever questioned about these discrepancies. "The little creature watches everything," he confided to Champion Grix Thalor during their morning training session. "It studies my weapons, memorizes my routines, maps every surface in my quarters. Sometimes I catch it examining my armor like it's calculating stress distribution patterns." "Impossible," Grix Thalor replied, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. "Humans don't possess the cognitive architecture for tactical analysis." Both gladiators glanced toward the observation areas where their assigned children sat quietly, displaying the kind of patient stillness that could be interpreted neither as docile obedience or predatory focus. The distinction had become uncomfortably difficult to determine. The children had indeed been watching everything. They had studied Zephyrian anatomy until they could identify pressure points with surgical precision. They had analyzed facility security until they could navigate the complex without triggering detection systems. They had mapped behavioral patterns until they could predict gladiator movements with actuarial accuracy. Most importantly, they had established communication networks that allowed them to coordinate activities while maintaining the appearance of isolated compliance. 24 human children remained in gladiator custody, and each had assumed responsibility for specific aspects of what they had begun calling the project. The project had multiple phases, carefully planned objectives, and success criteria that would have impressed military strategists across the galactic community. It represented the kind of comprehensive operational planning that Arena Intelligence had confidently concluded humans were incapable of executing. Arena Intelligence was discovering, along with the rest of the Zephyrian Empire, that confidence based on incomplete data had a tendency to produce unfortunate surprises. The hunt had begun in earnest. The final tally, when Arena Security finally managed to compile their incident reports, made for fascinating reading. 27 Gladiator champions had been reduced to 8 in the space of 3 weeks, each death occurring under circumstances that defied both explanation and prevention. The survivors had barricaded themselves in heavily fortified sections of the complex, equipped with military-grade surveillance systems and enough firepower to level a small city. They were still dying. Champion Rix Valdor, whose expertise in systematic opponent dismantling had earned him legendary status throughout the Empire, discovered that his skills translated poorly to defending against enemies who refused to engage in direct confrontation. His reinforced quarters had been transformed into a fortress, bristling with detection equipment and automated defense systems calibrated to respond to any unauthorized movement larger than a common insect. The modifications proved inadequate when his atmospheric recycling system began introducing trace compounds that his medical scanners identified as highly sophisticated neurotoxins. The delivery method remained undetectable despite comprehensive analysis. The chemical composition defied identification despite access to the galaxy's most advanced laboratories, and the source appeared to be coming from within sealed air circulation systems that no creature larger than a maintenance drone could possibly access. Rix Valdor expired while surrounded by enough defensive technology to protect a military command center, killed by an enemy he never saw, using weapons he couldn't identify delivered through vectors he couldn't trace. His assigned human child was found in its usual location, displaying its customary expression of innocent bewilderment when questioned by investigators. The pattern had evolved beyond simple elimination into what military analysts would have recognized as psychological warfare conducted at a level of sophistication that challenged conventional assumptions about human cognitive capabilities. The remaining gladiators weren't simply being killed. They were being systematically demoralized through the methodical destruction of everything they thought they understood about predator-prey relationships. Champion Grix Thalor, whose 43 consecutive victories had made him the unofficial leader among the surviving champions, attempted to organize a coordinated response to what he was beginning to suspect might be an organized campaign. He gathered the 4 remaining gladiators in the arena's most secure conference chamber, equipped with detection systems calibrated to identify any life form larger than bacterial colonies. "We're dealing with something beyond our current understanding," he announced to his assembled colleagues. "These creatures possess capabilities that contradict every assessment in their species profile." The other champions nodded agreement, though their attention kept drifting to the small viewing chamber where their assigned children sat quietly observing the proceedings. The transparent barriers were rated to contain explosions, the surveillance systems could detect molecular-level movement, and the security protocols would trigger immediate response to any unauthorized activity. The children sat motionless, hands folded, displaying the kind of patient attention that could be mistaken for docile observation if one ignored the calculating intelligence behind their eyes. Champion Zek Haroth never made it back to his quarters that evening. He was discovered the following morning in a service corridor, having apparently encountered something that had dissected his combat-grade nervous system with surgical precision, while leaving the rest of his anatomy essentially intact. The forensic analysis suggested knowledge of Zephyrian neurological architecture that exceeded the expertise available to most medical professionals in the Empire. When arena security arrived to investigate, they found his assigned human child waiting patiently beside the body, displaying what appeared to be appropriate distress responses to the discovery of its deceased caretaker. The arena complex, which had once echoed with the roars of triumphant gladiators and cheering spectators, had grown unnaturally quiet. The few remaining champions moved through the corridors like hunted creatures, jumping at shadows and checking constantly for signs of pursuit by enemies they couldn't locate or identify. High Arbiter Vex Calamar, observing the situation from his secure administrative chambers, finally acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. The gift he had bestowed upon his gladiator champions had not been pets or entertainment. He had given apex predators to creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to kill things much larger and stronger than themselves. The Zephyrian Empire had built its reputation on the simple principle that superior strength guaranteed victory. They had conquered dozens of species through the application of overwhelming force, establishing themselves as the dominant predators in local space through their natural advantages in size, strength, and aggression. They had never encountered a species that treated superior strength as merely another problem to be solved through superior intelligence. The arena fell silent as the last gladiator champion met his end, not in glorious combat before cheering crowds, but alone in the darkness, eliminated by an enemy that had never needed to be larger or stronger, only smarter and more patient. 27 human children emerged from the complex as the new apex predators, having demonstrated that in the grand hierarchy of galactic civilization, physical dominance ranked considerably below tactical intelligence and the willingness to use it without restraint. The cubs had indeed been given to gladiators as toys. The miscalculation had been assuming that being small made something prey.